When Jens Lingard stood on a windswept Montana hillside in the autumn of 1883 and drove a rusted pickaxe into the frozen earth, his neighbors didn't just think he was building a house. They thought he was digging a mass grave for his own wife and children. The wind that afternoon was already carrying the sharp, bitter scent of early winter, howling down the Deer Lodge Valley and rattling the loose pine shingles of Ezra Finch's trading post. Inside the warm, wood-smoke-filled outpost, 17 local pioneers had gathered, seeking shelter from the chill and sharing gossip over hot coffee. Jens, a quiet Danish-Norwegian immigrant with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many harsh northern winters, stepped up to the rough-hewn wooden counter. He unrolled a set of large, hand-drawn schematics, pinning the edges down with heavy brass weights. Jens explained in his careful English that he planned to dig deep into the south face of Anderson Hill. He wanted to go 18 feet deep, building a sandstone foundation at the entrance, a thick sod roof over the excavation, and a vertical draft shaft breaking through the very peak of the hill. Silas Thorne, the settlement's most respected and boisterous cabin builder, leaned over the counter. Silas had built nearly 24 log cabins in the territory, and his word on construction was practically law. He stared at the drawings, let out a booming laugh, and shook his head with open contempt. He told Jens that he was talking about a dirt hole, a glorified root cellar, and asked how a proper firebox would ever draw in a cave. He warned Jens that the Montana winter would kill him and his family, and that the hillside would eventually collapse on his wife and children. The men in the outpost nodded in organized agreement. They had spent years perfecting the art of building traditional log cabins, packing the timber seams with clay and moss, raising tall stone chimneys, and relying on massive hearths to fight the mountain winters. To them, what Jens was proposing was backward, primitive, and completely reckless. Jens looked at the skeptical faces around him, his expression remaining perfectly calm. He explained that his grandfather had lived in a traditional earth home in Nordland, where the winters were longer than they were in Montana, and the wind never stopped. He told them that his grandfather's home was cut deep into the hillside, and his family had survived there for 4 generations. It was a shelter that worked with the earth, not against it. Before we reveal how Jens Lingard's seemingly insane tunnel home outperformed every conventional cabin in the territory, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, because this survival wisdom works anywhere winter bites hard. By subscribing, you will learn building techniques so effective that modern engineers are still rediscovering their principles today. Jens Lingard was not a man who took unnecessary risks, but he was a man driven by a profound protective fear. As he walked back toward his temporary campsite, the memories of the previous winter clawed at his chest. They had lived their first Montana season in a standard, single-wall log cabin they rented near the valley floor. On paper, it was a respectable cabin, but in reality, it was a drafty sieve. Jens remembered waking up in the dead of night to the sound of his 5-year-old daughter, Astrid, coughing a wet, rattling sound that made his stomach knot with panic. He remembered the feeling of absolute helplessness as he stood in the dark, watching his wife, Karen, pile every wool blanket and heavy quilt they owned onto their children's beds, while the indoor temperature plummeted toward freezing. No matter how high Jens stacked the logs in the stone fireplace, the cold Montana wind scoured the heat away. The wooden plank floors, raised slightly off the frozen dirt, acted as a direct conduit for the ground's bitter chill. Jens had spent half his nights tending the fire, burning through nearly 10 cords of wood before spring arrived, and still, his family had spent 3 months shivering. Astrid's lung fever had lingered until May, leaving her frail and pale. Jens had promised himself, and his wife, that they would never endure another winter like that. He had told Karen that they could not fight the wind with timber alone, and that they must go where the wind could not find them. Karen had trusted him, even when he told her about his grandfather's traditional sod and earth homes of northern Scandinavia. He explained how those ancient structures utilized the natural weight of the earth to create a silent, heavy warmth. They didn't rely on massive, roaring fires that consumed whole forests. They relied on insulation and isolation. So, when Jens saw the steep south-facing slope of Anderson Hill, he knew he had found their sanctuary. The hillside was composed of dense, stable clay and sandstone, offering the perfect medium for a subterranean home. He recorded his claim at the territorial office, ignoring the raised eyebrows of the clerk, and prepared his tools. He knew his neighbors thought he was foolish, but as he looked at Astrid, who was running through the autumn grass with a healthy color in her cheeks, Jens knew that their disapproval was a small price to pay for her survival. The excavation of Anderson Hill began in the third week of October, and it was a grueling, bone-crushing test of human endurance. Jens stood at the face of the slope, his pickaxe swinging in a methodical rhythm, striking the clay that had been compacted over thousands of years. Each strike of the pick sent a dull vibration up his arms, bruising his palms and straining his lower back. Karen worked alongside him, her face smudged with dark dirt as she used a flat-nosed shovel to load the loosened clay into a wooden wheelbarrow. Even young Niels, their 8-year-old son, helped by wheeling the heavy loads down the slope, dumping the excavated earth into a growing red pile at the base of the hill. By the end of the first week, they had carved a shallow niche into the hill, but the sheer volume of earth remaining was daunting. The clay was thick and stubborn, clinging to the shovels and resisting every effort to be moved. On the fourth day, a cold rain began to fall, turning the loose clay into a slick, heavy mud that threatened to slide back into the excavation. Jens' boots lost their traction on the slope, and he slipped, tumbling into the mud and gashing his forearm against a sharp piece of buried sandstone. Karen begged him to stop for the day, but Jens insisted they keep digging before the ground froze solid and left them with nowhere to go. As they worked, neighbors occasionally rode past on the valley trail. They would pull their horses to a stop, watching the family covered in red mud, and whisper among themselves. Some of the women from the settlement, carrying out what they considered a Christian duty, left old wool blankets and scraps of salted pork at the edge of the property. They didn't speak to Jens. They simply shook their heads, convinced they were witnessing a desperate family preparing for their own demise. But Jens ignored the silent pity, spending his evenings after dark hauling heavy sandstone blocks from a creek bed 3 miles away to build a stable foundation for the entry. By early November, the excavation had reached its full depth of 18 feet into the south face of the hill. The tunnel was now a dark, cool chamber, measuring 25 feet long and 14 feet wide, with a curved ceiling that rose 8 feet at its apex. To prevent the immense weight of the clay hill from collapsing inward, Jens began constructing his internal shoring system. He drew on the organized, disciplined timbering methods he had observed in European coal mines, where wood was used to support millions of tons of shifting rock. He selected thick lodgepole pine logs, cutting them from his own timber lot and hauling them to the site with his single mule. Instead of simply stacking them like a cabin wall, he engineered an orderly series of coordinated 3-piece timber sets consisting of heavy vertical props and horizontal capsills notched together with precise mortise and tenon joints. He placed these timber sets every 4 feet along the length of the tunnel, wedging them tightly against the clay ceiling. Behind the timbers, Jens installed split cedar planks, creating a continuous wooden lining that held back the loose soil and prevented any small rockfalls. The space behind the lining was packed with dry pine needles and straw, creating a natural capillary break that would prevent any moisture from migrating from the damp clay into the interior living space. At the entrance, Jens raised his sandstone foundation, stacking the heavy creek stones without mortar in a methodical dry stone technique that allowed any water to drain away naturally. He dug a shallow trench along the floor of the tunnel, filling it with coarse gravel to act as a drainage bed, ensuring that any rising dampness from the earth would be channeled away from the living area before it could settle. Silas Thorne rode by one afternoon as Jens was positioning a massive pine capsule. He stopped his horse and looked into the dark tunnel, questioning whether the buried timber would rot from the dampness of the clay. Jens explained that the split cedar and the pine needles would keep the air moving behind the wood to keep it dry. Silas Thorne was skeptical, predicting that the spring melt would turn the structure into a timber coffin, but Jens kept working, locking his timbers into place with heavy wooden wedges. With the internal shoring secured, Jens turned his attention to the most vulnerable part of any subterranean home, the entrance. The entry faced precisely southeast, angled at 135 degrees from true north. Jens had calculated this orientation carefully. It allowed the low, flat winter sun to penetrate deep into the tunnel during the short daylight hours, providing natural warmth and light, while completely shielding the doorway from the prevailing northwest winds that scoured down from the Bitterroot Range. But Jens didn't stop there. He knew that a simple door set directly into the hillside would let cold air rush in every time it was opened. To prevent this, he designed a recessed entryway, setting the actual wooden door 4 feet back from the exterior sandstone face. This created a small, protected vestibule, an airlock of sorts that he sealed with 2 heavy, oil-treated canvas partitions hung from the ceiling. This design utilized the natural physics of air pressure. When the wind blew against the hillside, it was forced to compress as it entered the narrow sandstone vestibule. This compression created a high-pressure zone, an invisible cushion of air that pushed back against the incoming wind, effectively baffling the draft before it could penetrate the inner door. When someone entered the home, they stepped through the first canvas partition, closed it behind them, and then opened the inner door, ensuring that the cold air was trapped in the vestibule rather than entering the living chamber. Silas Thorne and Ezra Finch stopped by in late November to watch Jens install the inner door frame. Silas laughed, pointing his finger at the canvas partitions and joking that a Montana blizzard would rip the rags off their hangers. Jens explained that the curve of the hill deflected the wind, and the airlock stopped the rest. Silas Thorne remained critical, predicting that the rags would freeze stiff and trap them inside. But Jens secured the door hinges, packed the frame with wool felt, and closed the heavy oak door. It fit with a quiet, satisfying thud. By the first week of December, the interior of the Lindgard Tunnel home was fully realized, and it was unlike anything the pioneers of Deer Lodge County had ever experienced. Stepping through the airlock vestibule, the first sensation was not one of cold, but of a heavy, still quiet. The cavernous living space was warm and dry, with the split cedar walls and pine timber sets creating a warm, golden interior that was lit by a single kerosene lamp. Because the tunnel was excavated 18 feet into the hillside, the temperature of the surrounding clay remained at a stable baseline of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10 degrees Celsius, year-round. This was the fundamental principle of Jens's design, the thermal lag or decrement delay. The Earth is a massive thermal battery. It absorbs the warmth of the summer sun over months, storing that energy deep in the clay. As winter descends, that heat slowly migrates inward, delaying the freezing cold by several weeks. While the air temperature outside plummeted, the earth surrounding Jens's home remained warm, acting as a constant, passive radiator. Jens had carved 3 sleeping alcoves directly into the clay walls along the western side of the tunnel. Each alcove was 18 inches deep, raised 2 feet off the gravel drainage bed, and fitted with a sturdy wooden bed frame packed with fresh straw and heavy wool blankets. He hung thick canvas partitions across each alcove, creating individual, insulated microclimates. When his children, Niels and Astrid, crawled into their beds at night, their own body warmth, trapped within the small volume of the alcove, would raise the local temperature, keeping them warm without requiring a roaring fire. The first night they slept in the tunnel, Astrid whispered that she could not hear the wind at all. Jens tucked her in, telling her that the hill was protecting them. Karen sat at the small wooden table, watching her daughter fall asleep without a single cough, feeling the lingering weight of her anxiety begin to lift. For the first time in months, she felt safe. To ensure his family's safety, Jens had to solve the most dangerous problem associated with Earth-sheltered living: air quality. A tight, insulated subterranean space can easily trap moisture, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide, turning a warm shelter into a suffocating hazard. To prevent this, Jens had dug a vertical ventilation shaft at the very rear of the living chamber, boring upward at a steep angle until it broke through the hillside 28 feet above. He lined the shaft with split cedar boards, creating a smooth, insulated chimney that would resist creosote buildup and prevent any loose soil from falling back into the home. At the peak of the hill, where the shaft emerged, he installed a rotating copper cap, a design he had adapted from traditional Scandinavian gam dwellings. This cap utilized the wind to create a low-pressure zone at the top of the shaft, pulling air upward through the home in a coordinated convection loop. The physics was elegant in its simplicity. The cold, fresh air entering through the entry vestibule was drawn into the main living chamber, where it was warmed by the small corner stove and the family's body heat. As the air warmed, it became less dense and rose toward the ceiling, migrating naturally toward the rear of the tunnel. The rotating cap on the hillside peak pulled this warm, stale, moisture-laden air up and out of the shaft, creating a continuous, gentle circulation pattern that required no fans or external energy. Silas Thorne and Ezra Finch climbed to the peak of Anderson Hill to inspect the ventilation cap as the first hard frost of December settled over the valley. Silas Thorne stood near the copper cap, warning Jens that his vertical draft would pull all the heat straight out of the roof. Jens explained that they controlled the slow-moving draft using an adjustable baffle, keeping the air fresh without losing the heat. Finch expressed concerns about moisture freezing the chimney solid, but Jens reassured him that the constant, gentle airflow would carry the moisture away before it could accumulate. By mid-December, the first hard winter of Deer Lodge County had arrived in earnest, and the contrast between Jens's home and the rest of the settlement was already becoming visible. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began its relentless, howling march down the valley. Inside the settlement's conventional cabins, the fireplaces were running hot, their chimneys pouring thick, black smoke into the gray sky as families burned through their winter woodpiles at a frantic pace. But at the Lingard property, the hillside showed almost no signs of life. The thin copper vent on the peak of Anderson Hill emitted only a faint, shimmering heat distortion, with almost no visible smoke. To the passing pioneers, it looked as though the tunnel was silent and cold. The men gathered at Finch's trading post assumed Jens's fire had gone out and that he was freezing in silence, too proud to come in and ask for help. Silas Thorne agreed, claiming that the cave was pulling the heat straight into the ground and that Jens would be begging at his door before Christmas. But inside the tunnel, the reality was entirely different. The interior temperature held at a stable 62 degrees Fahrenheit, even though Jens burned only a few small willow logs twice a day. The family lived in comfortable warmth, their breathing creating no frost on the split cedar walls. Astrid's lungs remained clear, and she spent her afternoons playing on the dry gravel floor, her laughter echoing softly in the quiet, draft-free space. Jens had organized their daily routine to work with the natural rhythms of the earth battery. He kept the inner door closed, relying on the airlock vestibule to block drafts when he went out to care for his mule. The gravel floor remained dry, and Jens knew the deep freeze was coming, but he also knew his woodpile would outlast them all. The cold front arrived on the morning of the 12th of January 1884, with the sudden, violent force of an Arctic storm. The barometer at Ezra Finch's trading post had been dropping for 12 hours, and by dawn, the wind had shifted directly to the northwest, bringing with it a freezing air mass straight from the Canadian plains. The temperature plummeted with terrifying speed, settling at a killing -35 degrees Fahrenheit, or -37 degrees Celsius. The wind ran at a sustained 40 miles per hour, pushing the wind chill to a lethal -65 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the kind of cold that defined survival in the Montana Territory. It was a dry, silent cold that scoured the landscape, freezing grease in its containers, turning engine oil to thick sludge, and splitting the trunks of living pines with loud, explosive cracks that sounded like pistol shots in the quiet forest. No one went outside unless their life depended on it. Even the wolves had retreated to their dens, leaving the valley in a frozen, wind-swept silence. At the Thorne cabin, Silas stood near his massive stone fireplace, his hands trembling as he piled more dry spruce logs onto the roaring blaze. The wind was hitting his north wall with immense force, finding every tiny gap in the chinking and pulling the heat out of the room through convective cooling. Silas's north wall was already coated in a thick layer of white frost, and his water bucket had developed a half-inch crust of ice. His wife, Martha, sat on the edge of their bed, wrapped in 3 wool quilts and a heavy buffalo skin, her teeth chattering as she held their shivering children close. Martha begged Silas for more wood, But Silas knew his outdoor woodpile was frozen into a single, solid mass of ice and snow. Breaking a log loose required minutes of swinging a splitting maul in the sub-zero wind, a task that threatened to freeze his fingers within minutes. He looked out his frosted window toward the south, wondering how the Lingards were surviving, and muttered a quiet prayer, certain that their tunnel home must be an icebox by now. By the third day of the deep freeze, the conventional cabins of Deer Lodge County were in a state of silent, desperate siege. The cold had scoured the heat from the timber walls, turning the log structures into cold sinks that sucked warmth from the interior air faster than any fireplace could replace it. Across the settlement, families were burning wood at rates they had never anticipated, their winter supplies vanishing into the flames. At the Morrison cabin, Samuel had burned through nearly 3 cords of split pine in just 72 hours. His family had abandoned their bedrooms, sealing the doors with heavy wool blankets, and moved their bedding directly alongside the fireplace. The air in the room was thick with acrid smoke, a result of the extreme cold freezing the creosote in the chimney flue, blocking the draft and forcing the smoke back into the living space. Samuel's wife coughed, adjusting the wet rags they had stuffed along the baseboards to slow the freezing drafts, while Samuel struggled to clear the chimney blockage. The Hendersons had run out of dry firewood entirely on the 4th morning, forced to burn green cottonwood they had cut in November. The wet wood hissed and sputtered, producing a cold, smoky flame that barely heated the hearth. Their floor temperature had dropped to 24 degrees Fahrenheit, and frost had formed on the inside of their bed frames. Even Silas Thorne, with his professionally constructed double-chinked cabin, was losing the battle. He sat near his stove, his eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep, having taken 40-minute shifts with his oldest son to feed the fire for 4 straight days. His woodpile was nearly empty, and he had been forced to burn 3 of his kitchen chairs and a heavy oak storage bench just to keep the room above freezing. The settlement was freezing, their resources depleted, and their energy exhausted by the relentless, coordinated assault of the cold and wind. And through it all, they looked toward Anderson Hill, expecting to see some sign of life. But the hillside remained silent, covered in a heavy, undisturbed blanket of snow, with only a thin, shimmering draft rising from the copper cap. Inside the Lingard tunnel home, the contrast was so profound it seemed to belong to a different world. While the wind scoured the valley at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of the earth-sheltered home remained at a quiet, stable 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Jens sat at his wooden table, carving a small toy horse for Niels, while Karen prepared a pot of venison stew on the corner stove. The family wore only their regular wool shirts and trousers, their faces relaxed, their breathing creating no vapor in the warm, still air. Astrid sat on a rag rug near the center of the room, her doll in her lap, her lungs clear and her laughter bright. The physics of the Earth battery was performing exactly as Jens had designed. The thousands of cubic feet of clay surrounding the tunnel, insulated from the outside cold by 18 feet of earth, and the massive snowdrift that had accumulated on the windward side, held steady at its baseline of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The small corner stove, burning only 4 or 5 seasoned willow logs every 12 hours, had to do very little work. It only had to raise the temperature of the still air by 14 degrees to reach a comfortable warmth. Because the air gap and cedar shoring prevented any cold drafts, the temperature throughout the living space remained remarkably uniform. There were no cold corners, no frost-coated walls, no ice forming on floorboards. The gravel drainage bed kept the floor dry and warm, while the ventilation shaft maintained a constant, slow air exchange that pulled all moisture and carbon monoxide up and out, replacing it with fresh air that was pre-warmed as it passed through the recessed entry vestibule. Karen stirred the stew, pointing out that they had used less than a quart of wood since the storm began. Jens reassured her that they didn't need to fight the cold when they had the earth on their side. When young Niels asked why Silas Thorne's cabin was so cold if he was such a skilled builder, Jens explained that while Silas knew wood, he did not understand how to work with the earth. On the 5th morning of the deep freeze, Martha Thorne could no longer endure the anxiety. Her own cabin was a cold, smoke-filled cage. Her children were shivering despite their blankets, and she was convinced the Lingard children must be dying in their subterranean grave. She announced to Silas that she was going to check on them, despite his warnings about the dangerous cold. She packed a small sled with 2 heavy wool quilts and a jar of hot broth, and stepped out into the killing wind. The cold hit her face like ice, and her breath crystallized on her wool scarf instantly. The wind was so strong it threatened to knock her off her feet, but she struggled through the waist-deep drifts, her eyes fixed on the distant white shape of Anderson Hill. It took her 40 minutes to cover the mile to the Lingard property, her fingers and toes numbing, her lungs aching from the freezing air. When she finally reached the hillside, she saw no cabin, no chimney, only a massive, aerodynamic snowdrift that covered the slope. She found the recessed entryway, dug through a 3-foot drift to reach the door, and knocked with her frozen mitten. The door opened almost immediately. Karen Lingard stood there, her face warm and relaxed, wearing a simple cotton dress under her apron. She quickly pulled Martha inside. Martha stepped through the canvas airlock into the main living chamber, and her world shifted. The warmth hit her face like a physical hand, a heavy, silent, tranquil warmth that smelled of pine needles and hot stew. She stood in the center of the room, blinking in the soft light of the lantern, her chattering teeth suddenly still. She looked at Astrid and Niels, who were playing on the floor in their bare feet, and then at the tiny stove that held a fire no larger than a candle. She slowly unbuttoned her buffalo skin coat, her hands trembling as the circulation returned, and let out a long, shuddering breath that held no vapor, whispering in disbelief at how warm they actually were. Thomas Silas Thorne arrived at the Lingard property 2 hours later, his face pinched with cold and his heart heavy with dread. He had followed his wife's tracks through the snow, convinced she had gone mad, but when he stepped through the recessed sandstone entryway and closed the inner oak door behind him, his defense mechanism crumbled. He stood in the middle of the 12 by 24-foot room, his heavy wool mittens dripping onto the dry gravel floor, and stared at the thermometer hanging from the pine timber post. It read 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas pulled his own calibrated spirit thermometer from his coat pocket, holding it steady for 5 minutes. It registered exactly the same. Silas admitted in a quiet, cracked voice that it shouldn't be possible to stay so warm inside when it was 35 below outside. Jens handed him a cup of hot chicory coffee, explaining that the clay was acting as a massive heat battery, absorbing the warmth of summer and releasing it slowly. Silas Thorne looked at the tiny pile of willow logs near the hearth, then at his own empty woodpile and the charred remains of his kitchen chairs. He had burned through nearly 10 cords of wood to maintain a freezing 40 degrees, while Jens had used less than a cord and a half to live in absolute comfort. The logic was mathematically perfect, and the humbling was complete. Silas sat at the wooden table, his shoulders slumping, and took a long sip of the hot coffee. He admitted to Jens that he had been completely wrong about his design, realizing that his own cabin had been the real grave. By late spring of 1884, the story of the Lingard Tunnel home had spread throughout Deer Lodge County, completely reshaping how pioneers prepared for winter. As the seasons reversed, the temporary condensation cycle Jens had predicted did arrive. Warm, humid spring air hit the cold interior clay, creating moisture on the walls. But instead of panicking, Jens taught his neighbors how to manage it, using quick willow fires to dry the air, placing absorbent charcoal trays made from hearth embers, and utilizing the ventilation shaft to create cross-drafts. The practical men of the valley swallowed their pride. 11 families approached Jens that summer, asking for his help in designing earth-sheltered homes on their own properties. Even Silas Thorne restructured his building business, incorporating sandstone foundations, deep airlock entryways, and earth sheltering into his cabin plans. By the winter of 1885, the hillside tunnel design had become a recognized and preferred building technique across the territory. Pioneers stopped trying to fight the mountain winds with timber alone. They had learned the value of the earth's silent, protective mass. The greatest triumph of Jens Lingard's hillside gamble, however, was not the fuel savings or the professional respect of Silas Thorne. It was the sound of his daughter's clear, unbroken breathing. All winter, Astrid's lungs remained clear. She experienced no fevers or coughing, completely validating her father's struggle. The damp cold that had nearly taken her life the previous year was gone, replaced by the steady, dry warmth of the deep clay. The tunnel home stood occupied and functional for over 40 years, outlasting dozens of conventional timber cabins that rotted, burned, or collapsed under snow load. It remained a monument to common-sense engineering and the quiet courage of a father who dug into the earth to protect his children. The earth remembers what humans so easily forget. Sometimes progress is not about finding some new complex technology, but about having the humility to listen to the ancient wisdom of those who came before. Jens had built his sanctuary, and the hill had kept them warm.